Before departing for Terra, and after making Horus the War Master, the Emperor proposed that Horus's legion be renamed to the Sons of Horus, a tribute itself to the War Master, making him first amongst equals by proxy. Yet at first he would decline, being unwilling to set himself that much apart from his brothers. Be this for pragmatic reasons or because he genuinely did not see himself as first amongst equals or superior to them in any explicit way, we'll never be able to know. However, he was eventually convinced by Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, to accept the name change. The Emperor of Mankind would then choose to turn away from the crusade as he begun his Webway project. His departure was not explained to any of the Primarchs, nor to any of his armies, as it was a greater purpose that he was now serving. A secret purpose, creating his own version of the many cities within the Eldari Webway. This was an undertaking that would reshape mankind's future, and in essence, decouple them almost completely from their reliance on the Warp and Psychers, starving out the Chaos Gods and most other Chaos entities. In his refusal to share his grand design, he would leave a void, as Horus and the other Primarchs never truly came to terms with his absence, and what had once been a brotherhood of demigods, steered down the path of humanity's glory, now was a cadre of warlords, simmering with jealousy and unanswered questions, their doubts left only to fester. And within those fractures, the Horus Heresy would be born. 007 M31, in the aftermath of the destruction of the Aurelian technocracy and the securing of its rare and valuable STC templates, Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Wordbearers, sought to strengthen his legion's might through an unholy alliance. One such pact was struck with the traitorous Fabricator General, Kelbor Hal, whose allegiance had already shifted towards the forces of chaos. Under this alliance, the Dark Mechanicum would come to be born, and it was commissioned to build a series of warships for the Wordbearers. The first of these vessels was known as the Furious Abyss, a towering warship designed to play a pivotal role in the downfall of the Ultramarines. The Wordbearers had received secret orders from their traitorous War Master, Horus, to engage in a swift and brutal strike against the Ultramarines. This was in order to prevent them from reinforcing the Loyalist forces in the coming conflict on Terra with their overwhelming numbers. And for this, the Furious Abyss was integral, as it was designed specifically to remain hidden until just the right time for them to strike and cause the maximum amount of chaos. However, a small but determined Loyalist strike force led by Captain Lysamus Kestris of the Ultramarines infiltrated the warship and sabotaged its critical plasma generatorum. The resulting chain reaction led to one of the most catastrophic self-detonations of any warship in humanity's history, and the complete and catastrophic destruction of the Furious Abyss. This act of self-sacrifice by the Loyalist legionaries ensured that the traitors' plot to completely and permanently cripple the Ultramarines for the entirety of the heresy, along with devastating McCragg, was thwarted before it could even begin. 007 M31 would be the commencement of the single longest running continuous battle ever fought, known in the later years as the Calth Atrocity. The Battle of Calth marked one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Great Crusade. On this pivotal world within the realm of Ultramar, the Ultramarines Legion found themselves the target of a surprise attack by the Wordbearers. At the time, the majority of the Legion believed that they were their supposed allies. The attack was masterminded by Lorgar Aurelian directly, and driven by a strategy that sought not to completely and utterly defeat the Ultramarines, but rather to delay their reinforcements, which were seen as crucial due to their nigh inexhaustible numbers, to the defense of Terra. The Wordbearers targeted the orbital shipyards above Calth, devastating the system and inadvertently causing the sun of the Viridia star to erupt in a deadly solar storm that ravaged not only Calth, but nearby planets. This attack had far-reaching consequences, and the ensuing catastrophe led to the complete destruction of Calth's atmosphere, erasing its once lush and rather peaceful biosphere. Further exacerbating this devastation, Erebus, the Wordbearer's first chaplain, conducted a dark sorcerous ritual amidst this chaos, summoning the legendary Ruinstorm, which was an immense warp storm that severed communications between Terra and half the galaxy for several years. The battle would soon move underground, where it would rage on for many Terran years. Within the subterranean caverns of Calth, the survivors of the Ultramarines and their allies were forced to live there in these dark, enclosed environments in order to avoid the radiation-scorched surfaces, while both Roboute Guilliman and the majority of the Ultramarines survived, the battle's aftermath, along with the birth of the Ruinstorm, would severely hinder the 13th Legion's ability to contribute to the Siege of Terra, just as Horus had hoped. And coincidentally, the Ultramarines along with their Primarch have decided to not consider the Battle of Calth ended until every last word-bearer is slain. Barring that, the battle will continue until Kingdom Come and trumpets sound. For the past 40 years, the word-bearers, led by the Primarch Lorgar Aurelian, had nursed a grudge in secret. Once they were the most devout of all Space Marines, and due to this, the word-bearers would eventually be publicly shamed and reprimanded by the Emperor himself through the use of Guilliman as a cudgel on the world of Kur. Castigated for their fervent worship of the God Emperor and stripped of their honor, they were forced to kneel before the dictates of the imperial truth. That day they vowed revenge, and now vengeance had come. The Ultramarines never saw the strike coming. Without warning, the word-bearers had turned their guns on their former allies, unleashing a devastating ambush. Guilliman's fleet, caught in the open and unprepared for such treachery, especially at that grand a scale, suffered horrific losses as the word-bearers' ships ripped through their formations. On the surface, the situation was even more dire. Tens of thousands of Ultramarines were already deployed, their defenses incomplete, and their forces counting on backup from above. What had begun as a strategic muster turned into an utter and complete slaughter as the Battle of Calth ignited into a fury. Across the war-torn fields and burning cities, the word-bearers descended in overwhelming numbers, cutting down those Ultramarines who could still fight with a ferocity born of hatred and religious fanaticism. Those who had once been battle brothers now fought with the bitter sweetness of sworn enemies. The early years of this conflict saw Loyalists reeling and being pushed back across the vast stretches of territory that were Calth. At this moment, the traitors were exalted, reveling in the massacre, certain that their hated rivals would soon be fully annihilated. But Guilliman was not so easily beaten. Amidst the wreckage of the battle, a lone beacon of hope remained, Guilliman's personal flagship. Though it was grievously damaged in the initial onslaught, it had survived. With emergency repairs hastily undertaken, the vessel simply limped through the void, gathering what remnants of the 13th's scattered fleet remained, regrouping, assessing their damage, and adapting. This was one of Guilliman's strengths, one which had previously been noted by Corvus Corax, as after multiple simulations against his brother, Corax may have won individual engagements, but eventually the Ultramarines and his brother would adapt to his tactics and wear him down. Even as the battles raged across Calth's surface and the orbital space, the Primarch wasted no time sending a single desperate astropathic distress call directly to Macragge, the homeworld of the Ultramarines. If the word-bearers had intended to destroy the 13th Legion in a single decisive strike, it seems that they had failed, and the battle was far from over. The Ultramarines, in essence now in retreat, were all but broken, forced into a desperate fighting withdrawal. The Loyalist Space Marines on the surface dug in, establishing fortified positions across the war-torn surface of Calth. The word-bearers, in contrast, certain of an easy slaughter, soon discovered that they were quite mistaken. Many of the 13th Legion's warriors had been born on Calth itself, and these native sons fought with a tenacity and a fury that the traitors had not anticipated. This was their world, and they would not surrender it without a fight. In orbit, the word-bearers' fleet, still drunk on their perceived success, found themselves harassed by an Ultramarines counteroffensive. Guilliman, having regrouped the remnants of his legion's fleet, launched a series of well-coordinated hit-and-run attacks. The overconfident word-bearers suddenly found themselves completely under siege and forced to contend with an enemy that refused to die or fight on even terms. Despite their losses, Guilliman's forces refused to cede the battlefield, as the Primarch himself, ever the master strategist, conducted a comprehensive assessment of the conflict and established clear, precise lines of communication across the shattered Ultramarines' forces, at a pace which would boggle the minds of even the most astute of warlords amongst the Primarchs. And what had begun as a scattered resistance quickly became a cohesive counterattack as each defensive pocket received a detailed, synchronized series of orders directly from the Primarch. It was then that one of Guilliman's captains, Resimus Venatus, made his mark in history. Leading a breakout assault, Venatus and his warriors reclaimed Calth's defense laser silos in what originally appeared to be a seemingly small victory, which would have enormous consequences later. With the orbital defense network back under Loyalist controls, the Ultramarine gunners were once again able to provide critical fire support against the traitor fleet, ensuring that the battle within orbit would be much closer than the traitors had expected. With every lance strike, the Wordbearers' hold on the battlefield weakened significantly. The tide of battle had turned. Though heavily outnumbered and battered, the Ultramarines had done enough to slow the advance of the Wordbearers, forcing the traitorous legion into a war of attrition they had not expected or prepared for. And then would come the final blow. This would be as reinforcements arrived, as the remainder and a significant majority of the Ultramarines' legion mobilized from across all of Ultramar, surging into the Viridian system. The Wordbearers, with their initial element of surprise long gone, found themselves to be the ones who were now outmaneuvered and outnumbered, leaving them overwhelmed. Their fanatical fury, once an unrelenting storm of zeal and violence, would now buckle beneath the weight of Guilliman's unyielding numbers and tactical precision. The traitors were routed and their fleets forced into a retreat, abandoning those legionaries still locked in combat within Calth's underworld. But before the retreat, Lorgar's forces completed their final atrocity. With malice and cruelty, the Wordbearers would turn Calth's orbital defense platforms against the very star that had given them life within the void, the Viridian sun. As the outer layers of the photosphere were stripped away, its equilibrium destabilized, leading to a catastrophic increase in ionizing radiation, dooming Calth's surface to perpetual ruin, as the world would never be habitable again. Though the Wordbearers' fleet had been forced to flee, their presence remained in the shadows beneath Calth's ravaged surface, trapped alongside the 13th Legion's own survivors. The traitors Astartes waged a grueling subterranean campaign, one that would rage for several standard years after the initial battle. Here, beneath the irradiated wastelands, no quarter was given and no surrender was offered. The Underworld War had officially begun. Yet even as this brutal conflict played out in the darkness, the Wordbearers' true objective had already been largely achieved. The battle at Calth was never meant to be a simple military victory. It was a sacrificial act, as Lorgar essentially allowed many of his sons to be butchered as a great offering of blood and slaughter, fueling the climactic sorcery that would give birth to the Ruinstorm. This vast and unnatural warp anomaly severed Ultramar and around half of the galaxy from Terra. Now, with Guilliman and his forces cut off from Horus's path, the traitors had essentially removed one of their most formidable rivals from the Emperor's board. Yet, even in the face of disaster, Roboute Guilliman would not falter. Though Calth was lost and Ultramar was largely isolated, the 13th Legion endured, bloodied but unbowed. Guilliman turned to the only authority left that could guide him, the orders of Malcador the Sigillite, the Regent of Terra. With the Emperor locked away in the depths of the Imperial Palace, consumed by his secretive webway project, it now fell on Guilliman to rally the Loyalists and prepare for the next battle outside of the defense of Terra proper. The Horus Heresy had begun in earnest, and Guilliman knew this war was going to be one for the history books. In the grim aftermath of the Battle of Calth, the full scale of the carnage proved impossible to truly quantify. The surface of the world, once a thriving jewel of Ultramar, had been scorched beyond recognition, a consequence of the Wordbearers' final act of desperation. With the Viridian sun destabilized, the deadly levels of ionizing radiation flooded the planet, reducing its vast swaths of arable landscape into a scorched ruin that was beyond recognition, one which the Blood Angels would feel right at home with. The destruction made the recovery of the fallen a nearly impossible task. Now, thousands of bodies lay beneath the collapsed remnants of buildings and were incinerated in orbital bombardment or simply lost to the radioactive storms that swept across Calth. The death toll was so large it could nary be counted, leading to a loss of innumerable potential future recruits, thanks to the destruction of all that gene seed. But even in the surface of obliteration, the 13th Legion would attempt to keep its records as up-to-date as possible. Guilliman, ever the pragmatist, ensured that the casualties of Calth would be accounted for, with the same precision that had governed the Legion's greatest campaigns. When Guilliman and the remnants of the Ultramarines fleet withdrew from Calth, their losses had been tallied and estimated at 119,422 legionaries slain in battle, with an additional 28,392 2 listed as combat incapable, their bodies too broken to continue to fight without extensive medical care. And for the 13th Legion, this was not just a defeat, it was a wound that would scar them for the remainder of history. The devastation was so severe that many of the Legion's smaller chapter-like structures, once autonomous formations within Guilliman's grand military structure, had been reduced to less than a quarter of their operational strength. Some were so utterly shattered that they faced complete and utter dissolution. Their remnants reorganized and reabsorbed into surviving companies in order to maintain operational efficiency. And yet, despite these crippling losses, the needs of war took precedence over all else. Most of the wounded, those who could still hold a bolter and don power armor, were evacuated aboard the remaining fleet vessels and returned to service almost immediately. The Imperium was now burning, and Ultramar could not afford to let what warriors it could muster rest. For those left behind, the fate was far less forgiving. 40,000 Ultramarines, both wounded and battle-ready, remained stranded on Calth. Some chose to stay of their own volition and wrath, pledging themselves to protect what civilians remained who had been unable to escape. Others had no choice, their fate dictated by the brutal logistics of war. A crisis unfolding across Ultramar forced Guilliman into an agonizing decision. The military evacuation would take priority over the civilian lives. Though thousands were rescued, many more thousands were left behind to endure the horrors of what would follow. For the mortal defenders of the Imperium, the losses were even more staggering. The Extras Imperialis, those countless regiments of Imperial Army troops, suffered devastating losses at an almost unfathomable scale. At least 500,000 soldiers were believed to have perished during the beginning of the battle, their bodies left to the ruins of Calth. The Legio Paragus, one of the Titan legions sworn to defend Ultramar, was annihilated in its entirety. All of its god machines toppled and shattered, their once proud engines of war reduced to lifeless husks of what they once were. And yet, for all the bloodshed and all the devastation wrought upon the 13th Legion, it was the word bearers who had paid the heaviest price. Those traitor Astartes who had landed upon Calth found absolutely no escape, as 50,000 of Lorgar's gene sons had perished in the initial battle, their blood staining the irradiated soul. Though 20,000 more fell in the initial chaos of betrayal, those that remained were condemned to a nightmare of underground warfare, trapped in the subterranean war of annihilation that raged on for over a solar decade. The very ambush they had set had become their own tomb, as they were cut off from retreat. In essence, the word bearers had lost almost the totality of the forces they had committed to the Battle of Calth. The fact that the 13th Legion had never been a fleet-heavy force, and its strength lay primarily in its ground forces, along with the ironclad discipline of their legionaries, and the structured methodology of warfare of its chapters, meant that primarily the Battle of Calth had crippled their void assets, leaving them dangerously exposed but still combat ready in comparison to most other legions. What ships had survived were indeed scarred and battered, barely capable of waging further war, and with Ultramar under siege, along with the Imperium itself on the brink of catastrophe, the need for ships had become paramount, and so Guilliman was forced to authorize a grim directive. The wreckage of the battle that still drifted above Calth was to be scavenged. The shattered hulks of destroyed warships locked in silent orbit around the dying world held valuable resources, functioning reactors, untouched armories, and even survivors clinging to life with what little life support systems remained. The Legion had no choice. They directed the majority of their effort directly after the battle to salvage missions. These were not simply recovery efforts, as the radiation from the destabilized Viridian sun had turned Calth's orbit into a death zone. Void Walkers would now be tasked with reclaiming the dead and the dying from the battlefield of space, and they themselves would die in droves. But still, the Ultramarines persisted. Every weapon, every armor plate, and every ounce of raw material that could be salvaged was essential for the war that was to come. Such was the cost of survival, as many of the dead had their armor and equipment stripped from them immediately upon being located. The Battle of Calth was indeed a massacre, an act of premeditated treachery that left a once thriving world in ruin, and a legion forever changed. The Ultramarines had survived, but they had paid in blood for their continued existence, that along with Calth being little more than a tomb at this point. Yet even in this darkest hour, the Ultramarines would not break, as Guilliman turned his focus onto the engulfing war around Ultramar. The survivors at Calth swore an oath, one of vengeance. They would never consider the battle over until they had slain every last word-bearer in existence, be they a mere aspirant or the very primarch of the Legion. Amongst the Legion's many war hosts, only 5 chapters and scattered detachments escaped the slaughter at Calth untouched, their absence sparing them from the carnage, which nearly shattered the 13th Legion. These warriors, later known though never formally named as the Unmarked, had fought the Imperium's wars on distant battlefields. Their blades turned against Xenos and rebels, while their brethren bled beneath the guns of the word bearers. Yet their survival had also come at a cost, not in flesh, but in the silent, unspoken division that grew within the Legion's ranks. This would be a fracture that would never be acknowledged in the official records, never sanctioned by Roboute Guilliman, yet it is one that endured decades after the betrayal. Those who had stood at Calth and those who had faced annihilation at the hands of their once brothers had become something set apart. Even in this bloody victory, they gathered amongst themselves as a brotherhood forged in fire, sharing only reluctant camaraderie with those who had not stood beside them within the inferno. The bitter reality of Calth's survivors was one that was not easily dismissed. The horrors of the word-bearers' treachery and the wholesale massacre of those who had once been their comrades in arms had left them with an inescapable truth. Trust was a fragile thing, and war was a certainty. This mistrust would shape them for the rest of their days. Their campaigns would become significantly more cautious, methodical, and ruthless. Where the other Ultramarines fought with precision and discipline that had been Guilliman's hallmark, the Calth veterans fought with an edge of paranoia, always bracing for a strike that might come from within as well as from without. To them, preparedness was survival, and survival meant expecting treachery at every turn. In contrast, the Unmarked had never stood amongst such an ordeal. 2 of their chapters, the 7th and the 10th, had been deployed to the fringes of the Imperium during the Calth atrocity, far removed from the slaughter that had nearly claimed their legion. The 7th itself had been spread thin across the vast and perilous expanse of the Dominion of Storms, while the 10th had waged a war against the ravenous horrors of the eastern fringes. The remaining 3 chapters, the 19th, the 24th, and the 25th, had been tasked with garrison and training duties across Ultramar's many worlds, while their brothers at Calth had faced annihilation. These chapters had been secure within the bastions of the Imperium and unaware of the treachery unfolding until it was too late. And it would seem that this division between his own forces was at least part of the inspiration that drew Guilliman into dividing the Space Marine legions into chapters within his Codex Astartes. And though they would fight in the wars that followed, they would never be tested as the Calth survivors had been tested. They had never been hunted through irradiated ruins, never waged a war in the suffocating dark like that of the Underworld War, never stood at the brink of the total destruction of the Legion thanks to madness. For those who had endured such trials, this difference was impossible to ignore, and Guilliman recognized it. Even when the Horus Heresy ended and the Great Scouring began, the division within the Legion persisted. The Unmarked, those unscarred by Calth, found themselves increasingly assigned to distant campaigns, removed from the core of the 13th Legion's forces. Whether by design or instinct, Guilliman himself seemed reluctant to campaign alongside them, perhaps seeing them as a reminder of a past he wished to leave behind. And so they would be sent where they would no longer be an echo of a legion that had once been, to the far reaches of the Imperium, to wars that bore little consequence to the ashes of Calth. When the second founding came, it was the Unmarked who were amongst the first to be renamed, restructured, and scattered. Yet in many ways, they remained as a truest embodiment of the Ultramarines as they had existed before the heresy, untouched by the raw scars of betrayal, and unburdened by paranoia and grief, which had reshapen their brethren. They were the Ultramarines that had once been, before Calth had burned, before trust had been shattered, before the Imperium was forever changed. between 007 and 009 M31 would be when the Shadow Crusade would occur. In the wake of the Caliph atrocity, Roboute Guilliman was now filled with rage and became determined to extract a retribution from his brother for the betrayal of the Ultramarines, as he quickly assembled what vessels he could after being ambushed by Cor Ferron's forces at Caliph. Guilliman's forces, augmented by a fleet of Ultramarines ships that had not been in combat, pursued the word bearers through the use of novel astropathic choir manipulations. This pursuit led them to the start of the Shadow Crusade, an ill-fated campaign to reclaim 5 hive worlds of the Ultramar realm from the clutches of Lorgar's forces. Lorgar and the Wordbearers were now joined by Angron of the World Eaters alongside his legion, and together they launched a devastating assault on Ultramar. Their aim was to expand the Ruinstorm and spread its chaotic influence across the eastern fringes, further hindering the Loyalists' abilities to reinforce Terra. The Wordbearers laid waste to a total of 26 worlds, in a horrific testament to their religious zeal and devotion to the 4 craven gods. But eventually, Guilliman's retribution fleet caught up to them at Nuceria, Angron's homeworld. The Ultramarines then engaged the traitors above, scorching the surface of Nuceria. In the brutal battle that followed, the Wordbearers' flagship Fidelitas Lex was destroyed in a furious flurry of buoyed combat. As the Ultramarines would then storm the surface, they would be met with awaiting World Eaters, their fury unleashed in savage waves. The clash between the legions was merciless, with the World Eaters unleashing their bloodlust in a manner that was overwhelming the Ultramarines' disciplined ranks. Amidst this chaos, Roboute Guilliman faced off against his brothers Lorgar and Angron, the 2 traitor Primarchs, now wielding the terrifying strength and ferocity of chaos pushed Guilliman to his limits. In a fateful confrontation, Angron's chainsword struck Guilliman with a grievous wound, leaving the Primarch on the brink of death. Yet in a twist of fate, it was then that the Butcher's Nails implants began to finally kill Angron. And so, Lorgar was forced to unleash a sorcerous incantation that bound Angron's body and began his transformation into a demon prince of Khorne. Unwillingly. This brief reprieve allowed Guilliman to be evacuated and the Ultramarines to retreat, though many of his warriors would continue to fight, leaving Nuceria littered with corpses of Astartes, especially after the demon prince Angron had been born and reaped a glorious slaughter. The battle in Nuceria's orbit began with an act of desperation. Guilliman's flagship, Courage Above All, tore free from the warp at the system's edge, leading a fleet of 41 vessels. A battered force cobbled together from desperate war groups unleashed a lance thrust at the heart of the enemy. It was not a dedicated interdiction fleet, nor was it in prime fighting shape, but it would have to be enough. The Ultramarines' void strategy was precise and methodical. Cruisers and battleships moved in deliberate formations, exchanging devastating broadsides with the traitor fleet. All the while, the larger 13th Legion's warships would draw fire, forcing the enemy to engage with them, while lance strikes from supporting vessels strategically dismantled their enemy's defenses from range. This would be a multi-layered assault, a brutal war of attrition designed to weaken the traitor forces before the killing blow, in a manner that is comparable to the Tau's use of Kayon and Montka. But this was not merely a battle for space superiority. It was designed as retribution. As the Void War raged on, Guilliman's forces made a desperate push for Nuceria's surface. Determined to bring vengeance to Lorgar and the Wordbearers, led them to enacting an assault using drop pods, landers, gunships in mass numbers, in essence hemorrhaging from within the Ultramarines' vessels, hammering through the atmosphere in a desperate bid to reach the planet below as soon as they could. The World Eater's own flagship, the Conqueror, commanded by the ruthless and brilliant Lotara Serene, fought viciously to prevent any form of landfall, leading to smaller Ultramarines vessels being reduced to burning wreckage, torn apart by macro cannon fire as they attempted to break through the defensive line. But the 13th Legion would not relent. Even as they suffered losses, they eventually would be able to punch through the defenses, thereby landing troops on the blood-soaked world below. Meanwhile, up above, the word bearer's flagship, Fidelitas Lex, was forced to endure a relentless onslaught from Guilliman's armada. Its once majestic spires and cathedrals, symbols of Lorgar's perverse faith, were annihilated in a storm of fire and fury. Its void shields were merely a memory. Its armor cracked and broken, but still the warship fought on, its own macro cannons spitting in defiance even as the Ultramarines closed in. This was Guilliman's strategy, as they would bring down the Fidelitas first, bleeding it dry through deaths by 1,000 cuts, while the Conqueror itself, the stronger of the two traitor ships and the one more renowned for having a commander adept in void warfare, would be boarded and killed from within. One by one, the Fidelitas Lex's remaining defenses crumbled as its turrets fell silent and its counterfire weakened, its once imposing silhouette now marred by fire and ruin. The 13th Legion's fleet would then continue to rage a relentless pursuit on this now crippled warship, and they pressed the attack further still. Each bombardment, each broadside exchange, each strafing run, and each precision land strike drained the life from the traitor's vessel, until it was little more than a dying colossus, lashing out in its final moments. Above Nuceria, the traitor forces' flagships were forced to fight alone, isolated from one another, drowning in the righteous vengeance of the 13th Legion. The Lex now burned, while the Conqueror prepared for the desperate struggle that was to come. Below, the Ultramarines clashed with the forces of Lorgar and Angron, as the battle for Nuceria proper was spiraling into a maelstrom of war driven by vengeance, hatred, and the bitter ghosts of Calth. As the battle for Nuceria would intensify within the final moments of the Fidelitas Lex, it seemed the Wordbearer's flagship had one last barrage left to fire. In a moment of desperation, from its sides and underbelly, a myriad of salvation pods were ejected simultaneously into the black void, alongside heavier Mechanicum craft and the bulk of the landers. With the Wordbearer's legionaries already entrenched in the surface, the ship's human crew began to flee, seeking any semblance of safety in the chaos of the battle that continued on in the void. Still, the colossal flagship refused to surrender fully, defying its inevitable fall as it rolled and turned with all the rage of a dying beast. The Ultramarines' fleet, battered and bloodied, now found itself in a brutal close-quarter struggle, fighting not just the ship, but each other. This was no longer a matter of careful long-range exchanges. Instead, it had become a violent slugfest, a dirty war, fought on the edges of space, where every exchange was a struggle for survival, not just from their enemies' own lance fire, but potentially from their own. The Ultramarines' battle barge, Arsaman, intercepted the World Eater's flagship, the Conqueror, coming alongside and launching an assault of boarding torpedoes and assault carriers. In the midst of this chaos, the World Eaters, now occupied with repelling the boarders, found themselves blindsided as smaller Ultramarines vessels slipped past the Conqueror's defenses, unleashing their own drop pod assaults, gunships, and troop carriers onto the surface below. The first drop pod slammed into Nuceria's surface with a thunderous force. The Ultramarines, their power armor scorched and battle-worn from the horrors of Calth, emerged not as the pristine warriors they had once been, but as battle-hardened veterans with their armor marked by the brutality of their past conflict. They were not the same warriors who had fought across Armagatura or elsewhere on the front lines of war. These were men carried on by vengeance deep within their hearts, their eyes burning with the cold intensity of those who had seen too much and would never know peace. Despite their formidable resolve, the Ultramarines were met by the World Eaters, a force that now had reached a zenith of unmatched brutality. The World Eaters, their bloodlust heightened by the full implementation of the Butcher Snail's implants within their legions, charged with a savagery that was both horrific and awe-inspiring. The very fury of the galaxy seemed to clash into the Ultramarine strongpoints, with the World Eaters cutting through their defenses like a storm of roaring chain axes, unrestrained by anything but their own insatiable hunger for slaughter. Meanwhile, the Wordbearers were a different force entirely. Marching forward in grim unity, they chanted their hymns from the Book of Lorgar, bearing corrupt icons of bone and metal, each one an effigy of the twisted faith that had condemned the galaxy to an endless tide of war and slaughter. Their march was almost mechanical in nature, an implacable tide of zealotry and fanaticism. Each step taken was not in the name of a warrior or a mortal god, but it was taken in the name of their craven gods. Amidst this maelstrom of violence, the Fidelitas Lux continued its fiery descent into the Nucerian atmosphere. The massive ship shuddered violently as it fell, plasma engines dragging its stern downwards in a slow and agonizing descent. When the Lex finally struck the planet's oceans far from shore, it struck with a force that sent shockwaves across its entire surface, sending tremors through the ground as the world's oceans swallowed up the dying giant. As the battle now raged on within the surface of the planet, Guilliman found himself locked in a one-on-one confrontation with his brother Lorgar. After weeks of tracking and fighting, this moment was a culmination of a bitter hatred between the two Primarchs, a hatred forged through years of betrayal and sacrifice. Guilliman, armed with his power fist, faced Lorgar, who wielded his Crozius Arcanum, a weapon that gave the traitor Primarch the advantage in reach. When the two Primarchs met, it was no grand exchange of blows, there were no dramatic speeches. They came to one another at once, power fist against power maul, and in the resulting flare of energy, they were both sent back as the immense power of the clashing titans was too much for the physical world around them. Their respective legionaries fought and died, yet neither Lorgar nor Guilliman spared them the merest glance. Theirs was a battle that transcended the moment. It was a battle of wills, not merely of muscle and intellect, but one of the soul. Lorgar repulsed Guilliman's assault with a burst of telekinetic force, weak and wavering, but it was enough to send his brother flying across the air. In retaliation, Lorgar once more swung his Crozius, its power field crackling with energy, trailing with lightning as it smashed into Guilliman's skull. The force of the blow was like a cannonball. The Primarch of the Ultramarines staggered for a moment, but they both stood, bloodied under the darkened, oppressive skies of Nuceria, their bodies battered yet not broken. Guilliman bled internally, as his sternum had been partly crushed by the force of his brother's telekinetic strike, while Lorgar himself was bloodied, a gash splitting his forehead from where Guilliman's fists had landed, as he too recognized he had taken near fatal damage, his brain now suffering extensive amounts of bleeding. Yet their Primarch physiologies allowed them to continue on. As the two Primarchs were locked in a life and death struggle, neither was aware of the force that was about to descend upon the two of them. Angron, his armor shattered and drenched in the blood of his enemies, erupted from the ranks of the World Eaters, chain weapons at hand, as he cut a path through the Ultramarines' lines, tearing through the ceramite in a scarlet gore, not only taking the sons of Guilliman, but also slaying plenty of his own sons and those of Lorgar in an unstoppable animalistic frenzy. Angron was a terror on the battlefield. His mind may have been crippled and enslaved by the pain-inducing butcher's nails embedded deep within his skull. Yet in his agony there was only satisfaction, an almost grotesque pleasure in the carnage that he had wrought. Around his neck clung a bandolier of skulls, trophies from his past as a gladiator, and from many of his fallen warrior kin, his true brothers, collected at their gravesite. These were the skulls of the Desheka's Ridge's fallen, his comrades who had been massacred in an atrocity that had still haunted him to this day. Angron now reveled in this destruction, as his rage continued to burn even hotter, as this battle would continue to spiral on into madness. Eventually, Guilliman would shatter one of the skulls of Angron's former comrades, leading to the butcher's nails almost killing Angron, and in turn, Angron almost killing Guilliman. However, in order to save his brother, Lorgar would forcefully convert Angron into a demon prince of Khorne, once more turning him into a slave, rather than allowing him the freedom of death he so richly deserved. Due to the complexity of the ritual, and the now ongoing struggle between the World Eaters' remaining psychers, the Word Bearers, and those World Eaters lost to the Butcher's Nails, the Ultramarines took this chance to evacuate their now injured Primarch. Between 009 and 013 M31, and in the wake of the devastating Ruinstorm, the Imperium was in essence divided in two by the unrelenting rift that separated the very heart of humanity from its outer reaches. In part, this was because the once glorious Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided the Imperium's forces, had faded from sight within the region of Ultramar. Severed from its emperor and left in isolation for multiple years, the Imperium found it had no word from its distant ruler. Amidst this chaos, Primarch Roboute Guilliman, ever the tactician and empire builder, took a bold step. He declared the establishment of Imperium Secundus, a new empire forged in the wake of the emperor's absence, dedicated to continuing the fight against the traitors, preserving the Emperor's great work. This new Imperium sought to unify those remaining Loyalist forces in the face of the Ruinstorm, and Guilliman, ever the pragmatist, intended to make this an endeavor that would endure. As a symbol of unity, he proclaimed Sanguinius, the noble Primarch of the Blood Angels, as the rightful heir to the Emperor and the Imperial Regent. Not long after this, the Dark Angels, led by the ever-mysterious Primarch Lionel Johnson, arrived on the 500 Worlds, having been guided by the strange alien artifact known as the Ferris, which was found on the remote world of Sotha. Upon their arrival, the Lion was named Lord Protector of the Realms of Ultramar, in essence a rank equivalent to War Master, whose authority was only truly secondary to that of Sanguinius, allowing him to take command of the sum total of the military forces gathered there. This was a position he had once coveted, but now held only in proxy. But as history would show, even the greatest alliances can fracture when the dark forces stir and rumble, as the foundations themselves of Imperium Secundus were far from stable, as the treacherous Primarch Conrad Kurz, the leader of the Night Lords, who had been hiding aboard the Dark Angels flagship the Invincible Reason, would strike. Escaping from his confines within the ship's very bowels, he unleashed terror upon the world of Macragge itself, seeking to spread fear and chaos, making the beginnings of his reign of nightmare. Guilliman and the Lion would go on to confront him, but Kurz's cunning knew no bounds. Along with his gift of prescience, would allow him to lay a trap that caused a chapel to collapse upon both Primarchs, nearly claiming their lives. However, at the last moment, a Loyalist warpsmith of the Iron Warriors by the name of Barbarus Dantioch intervened, and he saved them, pulling them through a rift in reality caused by the Ferris. In communication with Guilliman, he had managed to open said portal, and waited for just the right moment to pull the two Primarchs to safety, but this was merely the beginning of the dark trials that would follow. Now, to go on to further detail, the Ruinstorm itself was a violent and unpredictable anomaly in the warp, which wreaked havoc across the galaxy, severing communication between the Imperium and cutting off vital astropathic choir contact, as warp travel became almost impossible, and the light of the Astronomicon itself was all but blotted out of reality. The Imperium now found itself divided. During the later stages of the Horus Heresy, the battle at Calth had already left the galaxy in turmoil, along with the Dropsite Massacre, but the true extent of this catastrophe had only become apparent when Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, realized that he was unable to discern any news beyond the limits of the Ruinstorm. From here, desperation began to take root in his heart, as he feared that Terra and the Emperor had already fallen to the forces of chaos. In his isolation and growing anxiety, Guilliman became obsessed with ensuring the survival of humanity and his father's grand design. And so he devised a plan to navigate the galactic turmoil. Using ancient and mysterious Xenos technology, known as the Ferris, which was a device located on the world of Sotha, he created a psychic beacon capable of guiding Loyalist Space Marines, lost in the disarray of the warp, directly to Ultramar. This device was the last fragile thread between the fractured segments of the Imperium at large. Miraculously, the beacon had caught the attention of Lionel Johnson and the Dark Angels Legion, who after much struggle used the signal to find their way through the warp and into the realm of Ultramar, deep within the heart of Guilliman's own domain. In another remarkable twist of fate, the Blood Angels, also guided by the Ferris, arrived at Ultramar. Sanguinius, their Primarch, had been leading his forces directly towards Terra itself, after the brutal Cygnus campaign. But he had been forced off course by the Ruinstorm. He, alongside Guilliman and Lionel Johnson, would form a triumvirate, a bastion of resistance, the very leadership of Imperium Secundus. Guilliman, in a moment of both sorrow and duty, proclaimed Sanguinius as the rightful heir to the Emperor and the new ruler and regent of Imperium Secundus, Emperor Sanguinius. As for the Lion, he was granted the position of Lord Protector of this emergent empire, effectively serving as a supreme commander of its sum totality of military forces and assets. This title was akin to that of War Master, one that Johnson had long coveted for himself. However, this left a sour taste in his mouth. With their combined leadership, the three Primarchs forged a new hope for the Loyalists, a future where the fight against the traitors could continue and humanity's unification might yet be salvaged. Yet the foundation of Imperium Secundus was not without challenge. Tensions quickly emerged when the Night Lords, Primarch Conrad Kurz, who had been functionally captured aboard the Dark Angels flagship the Invincible Reason, managed to escape from its bowels. His release set in motion a wave of chaos and terror that brought his madness to the heart of Ultramar, rampaging across the capital world of Macragge. His intent was clear: to spread fear and destruction, leaving the once hopeful creation of Imperium Secundus in disarray. The Ultramarines and the Dark Angels, along with their combined forces, soon found themselves tasked with a battle against the Night Lords, a confrontation that would culminate in a fierce clash between the two Primarchs. Both Guilliman and L. Johnson sought to put an end to Kurz' reign of terror, but Kurz's cunning proved a formidable adversary, as he had laid a rather intricate trap. Using a myriad of explosives he had procured from the Ultramarines and the Dark Angels, he intended to bring a massive chapel down upon the two Primarchs. As they confronted him, their efforts to end his life thwarted, as the Night Haunter escaped once again, leaving nothing but carnage in his wake. However, the fate of the two Primarchs would take an unexpected turn as the Loyalist Iron Warriors Warsmith Barbarous D'Antioch intervened at a crucial moment. Through the psychic portal opened by the Pharaohs, he was able to reach into the Maelstrom and pull out both Guilliman and Lionel Johnson to the remote world of Siltha. This miraculous act, guided by instinct, spared the Primarchs their lives and prevented their demise at the hands of the insidious Conrad Kurz. Despite this close call, Imperium Secundus was soon thrust into another test, the Battle of Siltha, which proved to be a pivotal moment for this fledgling empire, where the Ultramarines and their allies would face down the Night Lords for a battle of control and survival, each side desperate to secure the Ferris for their own. The outcome of this conflict would dictate not only the future of Imperium Secundus, but the fate of the Loyalist cause overall. In 009 M31, the Battle of Siltha would officially begin, at the very fringe of the galaxy, where the Ferris, a mysterious relic from a bygone age. This device allowed communication across vast distances and even allowed them to reach beyond the Ruinstorm for mere moments. Its discovery by the Ultramarines was both a blessing and a curse, as it would soon also draw in the attention of the Night Lords Legion. Following their defeat at Sangusla, the remnants of the Night Lords Legion, who were still loyal to their deranged Primarch, found their way to Siltha. Their goal was clear: seize the Ferris and use its power to find the remaining leaders and their flagship, the Nightfall. What followed was a brutal surprise assault. However, the Loyalist forces were scarcely able to mount a defense, and eventually the battle would reach its grim climax, when Warsmith D'Antioch, in an act of self-sacrifice, overloaded the Ferris as it was being overrun, ensuring the Night Lords could no longer utilize its empathic capabilities. His actions saved the Ferris from falling into traitor hands, but the cost itself was immense. Not only had the Loyalists lost their main tool of interstellar communication, but this act would also be said to be what attracted the Tyranid swarms to the galaxy 10,000 years later. 011 M31. In the pursuit of Conrad Kurz, the Primarchs would be truly relentless, in particular, the Lion. As the years passed, tensions began to rise within the ranks of Imperium Secundus, particularly between Guilliman and the Lion. Disagreements over security measures on Macragge, as well as the best way to deal with rebels, whom the Lion speculated were under Kurz's direct influence. These arguments became increasingly bitter when self-termination bombings slew several Astartes, in particular of the Lion's own lineage. This led to the Lion's paranoia deepening further and further still. In response, he imposed martial law across all of Macragge, and directly against the wishes of Sanguinius and Guilliman, he proposed and attempted to initiate orbital bombardments in order to obliterate rebellious factions within the Illyrium region, where he believed Kurz was hiding. The Lion's aggressive stance sparked open conflict with his brothers. In an attempt to capture Kurz, the Lion had dispatched his most elite forces, the Dreadwing, to flush the Night Haunter out from hiding. After a fierce confrontation within the city of Alma Mons, the Lion cornered Kurz. The two Primarchs would then clash in an open and brutal exchange. And after this, the Lion triumphed, overcoming Kurz's prescience through sheer skill and will alone. However, things from here would become far more chilling. When asked why he had betrayed the Emperor, Kurz simply replied, "Why not?" He revealed that he was haunted by the monstrous ability of prescience that was deeply ingrained into his mind, which had driven him into insanity. The Lion, torn between rage and pity, could not bring himself to slay his mentally deranged brother. Instead, he decided to cripple Kurz by snapping his spine, rendering him paralyzed for the foreseeable future, in large part due to the Primarch's own biology being so resilient, allowing him to eventually heal from this. However, the trials were far from over. When Kurz was presented Before the triumph of the Loyalist Primarchs, the Night Lord defended his actions, arguing that he had simply acted in accordance to his nature, one which was designed by the Emperor. The Lion's fury at Kurza's claims only deepened when the traitor accused him of secretly ordering the bombardment of Macragge. This was a divisive action whose validity could not be ascertained by the Imperium's records. However, it is known that this almost caused open conflict between the brothers. Sanguinius would then intervene right at the climax, breaking the Lion's blade in a display of authority and ordered his fellow Primarchs to stand down. It is important to note that Sanguinius was one of the few Primarchs that the Lion was truly close to, as he is one of the few that he openly respected and followed directions from, and he is the only one to be directly known to have hugged the Lion, without any form of negative repercussions. The banishment of the Lion and his Dark Angels followed swiftly, as the Dark Angels left Macragge behind, yet the Lion, as he prepared to depart, began to be filled with doubts. Standing alone in the chamber of the Titula engine, he questioned his past decisions, his role in Luther's banishment, and the death of Nemel, along with other choices that had weighed heavily on his conscience. It was then that the Lion had an epiphany and decided to return to Macragge. Upon arriving, the Lion revealed his true motive, as he had realized Kurza's precognitive abilities, which had foreseen his own death at the hands of the Emperor's assassin, were proof enough in the Lion's mind that the Emperor still lived. Sanguinius, ever perceptive and gifted with prescience in his own way, recognized the truth in the Lion's words. Together, the Primarchs decided that Kurz would live, but not as a free man, but rather as a prisoner of the Lion and a tool so that his prescience could be exploited. 013 M31 would be the start of the second siege of Chthoniya. Chthoniya, the homeworld of the Sons of Horus, now found itself under a direct assault. The True Sons, a fleet of traitor forces which had broken off from Horus's vast armada and bypassed Terra as a whole, began to lay siege to Chthoniya, with only a small force of Imperial Fists and Ultramarines garrisoned at Astagar Garrison in order to protect it. The Loyalists were quickly overwhelmed, surrounded on all sides. The hope for allied reinforcements to this siege seemed to dwindle as the Siege of Terra raged on, forcing both sides into a prolonged war of attrition. The arrival of the Dark Angel's fleet was a turning point for this siege, but victory would come at a staggering cost, as Chthoniya was rendered a dead world, uninhabitable and completely ruined, a graveyard and a reminder for the consequences of betrayal, and it would mark the inception of the separation of the fourth chapter of the Ultramarines into an entity with a unique identity that would later become its own chapter during the second founding. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the galaxy, Captain Praetor Arceus Odantus of the Ultramarines led a determined counterattack against the Wordbearers at Hornum. Striking unexpectedly, the Loyalists launched a furious assault, and the ensuing battle would rage on for 3 weeks, pushing both sides far beyond their limits. In their desperation, the Wordbearers resorted to summoning demons and unleashing the horrors of the warp. However, in the end, the Wordbearers were defeated, but Honorum lay in ruins, the cities obliterated by the savage conflict, and the corruption of the warp tainted the land in near perpetuity, ensuring that the scars of the battle would linger long after the world had passed. It is important to note that Kurz was only saved mere moments before Sanguinius prepared to pass judgment on him, as the Lion had materialized within the chamber, demanding the execution be ceased, as he revealed the Kurz similar precognitive visions to Sanguinius, and he had predicted his own death at the hands of the Emperor. The Lion argued that this meant that the Emperor had to be alive, even though technically the Emperor could have already set in motion the assassination of Conrad Kurz. However, the rationale led them to believe that the Emperor and what was left of humanity lay hidden beyond the Ruinstorm. This was a belief that resonated deeply within Sanguinius, who too had suffered from prescience and visions of his own death. In that moment, the Lion's theory was validated and acted upon, as Guilliman would demand to know what would become of Kurz, leading to the Lion making a promise to the Primarch of the 13th Legion that he would take responsibility for his brother's fate. Kneeling before his two comrades, the Lion would swear to serve as Kurz's jailer, ensuring that the Night Lord's Primarch would never again wreak havoc across the Imperium. And so, the Lion's exile, which at one time had seemed like the final act that would fracture the unity of the Loyalist cause. In fact, brought a new hope, and the line would once again become a warden, but this time, a warden to one of the most dangerous minds humanity had ever created, as the three Primarchs set upon to reach Terra and aid what was left of the Loyalist causes past the Ruinstorm. And the dissolution of Imperium Secundus would mark a profound shift in the course of the heresy. After the fracturing of this brief alliance, the three Loyalist Primarchs, Roboute Guilliman, Lionel Johnson, and Sanguinius, set aside their differences once again, and unified their Space Marine legions, with the singular goal of reaching Terra, the heart of the Imperium, and where the Emperor supposedly lay. Their journey was fraught with peril, as the vast, nigh-impenetrable warp storm had severed communication and travel between the galaxy's distant sectors, and it was only through an exhaustingly perilous passage that the forces of chaos had manifested within the warp that the Loyalists could pass. What would soon follow would be known as the Second Battle of Davin, a titanic struggle that saw the Loyalist legions clash against an overwhelming wave of demonic entities. The battle itself tore through the very surface of the planet, leading to the eventual destruction of the planet Davin itself, and the proposition of Chaos slaying the War Master in exchange for Sanguinius. However, after the destruction of the planet, a path through the Ruinstorm began to emerge, temporarily. Yet, as the storm receded, the traitor fleets commanded by Horus and his followers lay in wait, having foreseen the potential opening of this path. The traitors had deployed a series of defensive fleets to blockade any advancing forces from reaching the throne world, and so the stage was set for the final desperate push that would see the Loyalists fighting not only against the elements of the Ruinstorm, but also against the fleets of Horus and his traitorous kin. In the midst of this conflict, Sanguinius and his Blood Angels were tasked with leading a direct charge towards Terra. Guilliman and the Lion trusting Sanguinius' own precognitive visions to guide him. These visions, which had been a constant thread throughout the Primarch's entire life, guided his path as he raced towards the Emperor and his own eventual death above the throne world. His destiny inexorably and eternally tied with the survival of the Imperium. Simultaneously, Guilliman and the Lion orchestrated a series of diversionary attacks, directing their Ultramarines and Dark Angels legions, respectively, against the amassing, nigh uncountable traitor fleets. These engagements served to create a critical opening, allowing Sanguinius and his forces to slip through the blockade nearly untouched, and continue their journey towards the throne world. As the Ruinstorm continued to dissipate, Guilliman, gathering what forces he could, made his own push towards Terra. However, his path was far from clear, as the traitors had established a vast chain of hundreds of defensive worlds, all manned by Iron Warriors, their ranks bolstered by the deadly remnants of Horus's forces and the demonic beasts of the Neverborn. What followed was a grueling series of engagements that saw the Loyalists locked in fierce combat, each victory coming at a heavy cost, as the Ultramarines and their allies, though advancing steadily, suffered significant losses, not only in manpower and resources, but in time, as their determination would keep them on the course for Terra, where ultimately the fate of the Emperor and humanity awaited. Despite his best efforts, the Siege of Terra would come to a conclusion before he could bring the elusive twins' victory and vengeance down upon the traitors' heads.